My name's Debora Singer and I'm from an NGO in London called Asylum Aid, and I'm the Policy and Research Manager. And I'm going to be talking about assessing the credibility of women's asylum claims. The key reason why women in Europe are refused asylum is because they're not believed. So let's think of that in terms of a particular woman. Let's call her Malaika. And Malaika's escaping domestic violence. She comes from a country where there are no laws against domestic violence, or those laws aren't enforced, and she comes to claim asylum, let's say, in the UK. So the first thing that happens is that she's expected to have some documentary evidence of the persecution that she faces. But because she's escaping domestic violence, she doesn't have any documents. If she was a political activist, she would probably have a membership card for the opposition party or a photograph of herself at a demonstration, but you don't get a certificate for domestic violence. And because that's the first hurdle really at which Malaika falls, not having the corroborative evidence. But the next thing that happens then is that she's expected to rely on her oral testimony. And because of the shame and the trauma that she's suffered, she can't remember everything. She can't tell her narrative in the right order. She misses things out. And that again goes against her credibility. So that's the second hurdle that Malaika falls at. And the third hurdle is that the decision makers in the UK are using the wrong standard of proof. They're setting the bar too high in terms of the evidence that they're expecting from Malaika and the coherence they're expecting from her testimony. And it's the interaction of those three things that makes Malaika fail at her credibility assessment. The credibility assessment has a central role in the refugee status determination process. It's incredibly important. We did some research with some other partners in Europe looking at women's asylum claims, and we found that the credibility assessment was at the core of their refusals in every single case. And when we did some research ourselves at Asylum Aid, we found that when the judges looked at people's refusals, the women's refusals, they always, when they reversed those refusals, it was always because of the credibility assessment. So the initial decision maker wasn't believing the woman, but then the immigration judge was. And we also found that if you were a woman, you were more likely to have your refusal overturned on appeal than if you were a man. So there was a disproportionate impact. And we were really interested to know what was causing that disproportionate impact. And that's what we're going to look at in more detail now. And at Asylum Aid, we believe that's due to three particular factors: the standard of proof, to the lack of corroborative evidence, and to the impact of shame and trauma on disclosure. So firstly, in terms of the standard of proof, the standard of proof in asylum claims is really, really low. It's reasonable likelihood or real risk. And it's so low because it's really difficult for somebody who's fleeing persecution to collect evidence to take with them. And it's also so the impact of getting the wrong decision is so awful, so that somebody could be returned to danger in their country of origin. We found that in our cases that we looked at in Asylum Aid's research, that the immigration judge always mentioned the standard of proof. He always talked to, and he was, if he was reversing an initial decision, he or she always talked about the low standard of proof that's needed in asylum cases and the importance of using that. So I've talked about the too high standard of proof being used. And that really is relevant when you think about the need for corroborative evidence. So why is it more difficult for a woman to bring evidence that supports her case than for a man? There's a number of reasons. Because of the social mores and the gender roles in society, often women won't even have access to their own identity documents. In addition, again because of social mores, if they're a political activist, They might not be the person who's leading the demonstration or who's in the newspapers. They might be the people who are doing the background work for the opposition. They might be providing food and shelter or sewing uniforms, and they might not even have a membership card of the party, and they certainly might not know about the functioning and the structure of the organisation. The other thing that happens to women is that they're credited with the opinions of the men in their family. So they're thought to believe the same as them, and yet they may well not know anything about the activities of their husbands or fathers or brothers. And the other thing that's very different for women is that they're more likely than men to be affected by gender-based persecution. So things like rape and sexual violence, domestic violence, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, honour crimes, being persecuted because of their sexuality. And these types of persecution happen in the private sphere, and there's no documentary evidence for any of these types of harm. So the women don't have that sort of paperwork. In the EU Qualification Directive, in Article 4, it actually says what you can do if there's insufficient documentary evidence, and it says that you shouldn't need such confirmation in a number of cases, in a number of conditions, which include that the applicant has made a genuine effort to substantiate their application, that she's given a satisfactory explanation regarding any lack of documents, and that her statements are found to be coherent and plausible. The other area where you can get documentary evidence from is through country information, and so that will be evidence not that the woman brings with her, but that the decision maker should have. But it's really difficult to get information often about women's rights, about their economic, social, political and legal rights. Sometimes the country information doesn't include about the gender and social mores in the country, or about the prevalence of violence against women, or about state protection in relation to violence against women. So this all provides another hurdle that women like Malika fall at. So because of not having corroborative evidence, not having documents as evidence, a woman like Malika is forced back on her oral testimony, and having an oral testimony used as the primary source of evidence is recognised as being okay, especially if the persecution is by your family or by the community. But again, with oral testimony, women have an additional problem. The shame and trauma that they feel because of what's happened to them makes it really difficult for them to remember all the details, to tell their narrative in a coherent way. Their memory is affected and their concentration, and women experience dissociation and avoidance. Also, there's a number of reasons why a woman would find it really difficult to actually disclose what's happened to her. And we know that in our own countries in Europe, that a woman who's been raped finds it very difficult to tell other people. So because of the stigma and the lack of trust and the fear of rejection and ostracism and reprisal, women often either don't disclose what's happened to them at all, or they disclose it at a late stage, and then it's seen as going against their credibility. So the difficulties with providing oral testimony are an additional barrier, an additional hurdle for women claiming asylum. So these three hurdles and the interaction of these three hurdles, the using too high a standard of proof, the lack of corroborative evidence, and the impact of shame and trauma on disclosure interact to result in a credibility assessment that's negative. And this presentation has been based on a chapter that I wrote in this book, Gender in Refugee Law. And in that, I conclude that how these factors all interact. And I talk about how the standard of proof used by decision makers is often much higher than it should be for refugee status determination procedures, and that affects women disproportionately. It's less likely that they'll have evidence to corroborate their claims, and although decision makers aren't supposed to rely on that evidence, they do tend to do that. That evidence the lack of it is because of their political and social and economic status in their country of origin, or because of the nature of the persecution they've experienced. And because they don't have this evidence, they're forced back onto their oral testimony. And again, their women can be disadvantaged. So the shame and trauma they've experienced as a result of the gender-based persecution affects their memory, so their narrative and their evidence becomes less clear and less consistent. And the shame and trauma can prevent them disclosing what's happened to them at all, or they disclose it later on. And this interaction between these different factors means that it explains really the disproportionate impact of credibility assessment on women. And because they fail to get a positive credibility assessment, women also fail to get protection from persecution.